Welcome to AI-103 Practice Exam, Text Analysis Solutions. This focus set contains 20 original questions for language and speech analysis, translation, structured outputs, safety, PII, sentiment, lifecycle constraints, and production text decisions. Use each question to practice the design and implementation decisions you will need on exam day. Here is how this practice exam works. First, read the complete scenario and every response. Next, lock in your answer. You will have 3 silent seconds to commit, and you can pause the video whenever you need more thinking time. Then, I will reveal the correct response. Finally, I will explain why it works and reinforce the exam pattern. If this practice helps, like the video and subscribe to WebLizard CertLab for the next AI-103 set. Question 1. An engineering team is designing several speech translation features. Match each requirement to the supported implementation decision. Preserve the preview and input scope boundaries of LLM speech. Requirements. 1. Translate live multilingual speech into speech or text in real time. 2. Translate pre-recorded audio into text by using the preview LLM enhanced path. 3. Use the recommended keyless authentication for the preview LLM speech API. 4. Design downstream processing for a preview LLM speech translate response. Available targets. A. Use standalone Azure Speech Translation for real-time speech-to-speech or speech-to-text translation. B. Post multi-part audio to transcriptions. Transcribe with API version 2025-10-15, enhanced mode enabled, task set to translate, and target language set. C. Do not depend on word level duration or offset, diarization, or non-zero confidence for the translate task. D. Send the audio bytes to Azure Translator Text and request a spoken response from its text endpoint. E. Use a Microsoft Intra ID bearer token instead of relying on the speech resource key header. Lock in your answer. Correct response. 1. Translate live multilingual speech into speech or text in real time. Matches, use standalone Azure Speech Translation for real-time speech-to-speech or speech-to-text translation. 2. Translate pre-recorded audio into text by using the preview LLM enhanced path. Matches, post multi-part audio to transcriptions. Transcribe with API version 2025-10-15. Enhanced mode enabled, task set to translate, and target language set. 3. Use the recommended keyless authentication for the preview LLM speech API. Matches. Use a Microsoft Entra ID bearer token instead of relying on the speech resource key header. 4. Design downstream processing for a preview LLM speech translate response. Matches. Do not depend on word level duration or offset, diarization, or non-zero confidence for the translate task. Why this works. Standalone Azure Speech Translation supports real-time multilingual speech translation. Preview LLM Speech handles pre-recorded audio and uses a multi-part transcriptions transcribe request with API version 2025-10-15, enhanced mode, task equals translate, and target language. Microsoft Entra ID bearer authentication is recommended. For the translate task, word level duration and offset and diarization are unsupported, while confidence is unavailable and always 0. Exam pattern. Map real-time and pre-recorded speech translation requirements to separate supported paths. Then apply the LLM speech request, authentication, and response boundaries. Question 2. A support application must let a user speak naturally, have the model reason over the live interaction, call tools when needed, and answer with audio. The team wants a native, low-latency speech-in/speech out path rather than a transcription-only pipeline. Which implementation should the team select? A. Use Azure Language key phrase extraction and synthesize the return phrases as audio. B. Use Azure Translator with standard NMT and return the translated text to the client. C. Use the Azure OpenAI GPT Realtime API and stream audio through WebRTC, SIP, or WebSocket. D. Use Azure Speech Fast Transcription and send only the completed transcript to storage. Lock in your answer. Correct response. C. Use the Azure OpenAI GPT Realtime API and stream audio through WebRTC, SIP, or WebSocket. Why this works. GPT Realtime is the native low-latency speech-in/speech out path in the held evidence. A real-time voice agent session can listen, reason, speak, and call tools. Transcription, translation, or key phrase extraction alone does not provide that reasoning interaction. Exam pattern. Select a native multimodal reasoning path for an audio-first agent, rather than a speech conversion utility. Question 3. An existing workload still uses Azure Language summarization while the organization plans its migration before the service retires on March 31st, 2029. The workload will analyze text as is and will not customize a model. Arrange the implementation steps for one summarization request. Arrange all 4 steps in the correct order. A. Configure authentication with the resource key and endpoint. B. Send the text through the documented REST or client library summarization request. C. Create the Azure Language resource for the existing summarization workload. D. Analyze the summarization result returned for the submitted text. Lock in your answer. Correct response. Step 1. Create the Azure Language resource for the existing summarization workload. Step 2. Configure authentication with the resource key and endpoint. Step 3. Send the text through the documented REST or client library summarization request. Step 4. Analyze the summarization result returned for the submitted text. Why this works. For the held Azure Language summarization workflow, create the resource, authenticate with its key and endpoint, send a REST or client library request, and then analyze the result. The feature analyzes data as is without model customization. It retires on March 31st, 2029, so this sequence is scoped to the existing workload while migration is planned. Exam pattern. Order the documented resource-to-result workflow for an existing retiring Azure Language summarization implementation. Question 4. A team has a Microsoft Foundry resource in a supported region, a deployed GPT real-time model, and valid Microsoft Entra ID credentials. Its client still constructs a date-versioned preview URL and cannot establish the intended GA real-time session. Which change aligns the client with the held GA endpoint contract? A. Call the Azure Speech Batch Transcription endpoint with the real-time model deployment. B. Use the Voice Live endpoint because its WebSocket events are identical to real-time events. C. Keep the preview URL and replace Microsoft Entra ID with anonymous access. D. Use the OpenAI version 1 real-time endpoint and omit a date-based API version query. Lock in your answer. Correct response. D. Use the OpenAI version 1 real-time endpoint and omit a date-based API version query. Why this works. The held GA real-time contract uses OpenAI version 1 without a date-based API version query. A supported region Foundry resource, a deployed GPT real-time model, and API key or Microsoft Entra ID authentication remain prerequisites. Exam pattern. Diagnose a GA real-time connection that incorrectly uses a date-versioned preview URL. Question 5. A Voice Live agent performs real-time recognition of specialized maintenance terms. A phrase list is no longer sufficient, so the team will use custom speech for advanced input recognition. The team must evaluate quality and operate the model without assuming that future base model releases automatically change production behavior. Which 3 actions should the team take? Select 3 answers. A. Deploy the custom model to an endpoint for real-time use and update it explicitly when required. B. Allow each newly released base model to replace the model behind the deployed endpoint automatically. C. Train and use a custom speech model for advanced recognition fine-tuning of the audio input. D. Evaluate recognition quality with word error rate to decide whether more training is needed. E. Use custom voice instead, because output voice customization also fine-tunes input recognition. F. Rely on the batch transcription endpoint exception for every real-time and translation request. Lock in your answer. Correct response. A. Deploy the custom model to an endpoint for real-time use and update it explicitly when required. C. Train and use a custom speech model for advanced recognition fine-tuning of the audio input. D. Evaluate recognition quality with word error rate to decide whether more training is needed. Why this works. Custom speech is the advanced input recognition customization path, while custom voice changes synthesized output. Word error rate is the documented recognition quality measure. Real-time use requires a deployed custom endpoint. Only batch transcription can use the model without a hosted endpoint. A deployed model remains fixed until explicitly updated, and custom and base model snapshots have finite life cycles. Exam pattern. Plan input customization, evaluation, endpoint deployment, and lifecycle control for a real-time voice live recognition path. Question 6. A voice concierge uses a GA OpenAI version 1/real-time session and must support conversations that can last 75 minutes. During testing, the interaction ends when the original session reaches its documented maximum duration. Which design should the team implement to preserve continuity? A. Convert the session to batch transcription when it reaches 60 minutes and keep the same session identifier. B. Disable tool calling so that the original real-time session no longer has a duration limit. C. Monitor expires at, save conversation context, renew before timeout, and restore the context in the new session. D. Increase the session maximum to 75 minutes by adding a date-based API version query. Lock in your answer. Correct response. C. Monitor expires at, save conversation context, renew before timeout, and restore the context in the new session. Why this works. Each real-time session has a maximum duration of 60 minutes. For a longer interaction, the application should monitor expires at, renew the session before timeout, save the conversation context, and restore that context in the new session. Exam pattern. Design session renewal and state restoration for a real-time conversation longer than 60 minutes. Question 7. An agent already produces text responses. The application must speak those responses with an out-of-box neural voice and adjust pronunciation and speaking rate without creating a custom voice. Which implementation should the team use? A. Use Azure Speech text-to-speech with a standard voice and SSML controls. B. Use Azure Language summarization and train its underlying model for prosody. C. Use Azure Translator NMT and configure a regional translation endpoint. D. Use Azure Speech real-time transcription with a custom acoustic model. Lock in your answer. Correct response. A. Use Azure Speech text-to-speech with a standard voice and SSML controls. Why this works. Azure Speech text-to-speech converts text into synthesized speech with neural voices. A standard voice is available out of the box, and SSML can control pronunciation, speaking rate, pitch, volume, and related speech properties. Exam pattern. Select standard text-to-speech synthesis and SSML for controllable audio output. Question 8. A company wants a low latency voice agent that receives audio, returns audio, and can invoke an order status tool. The backend team does not want to manually orchestrate separate recognition, generative AI, and synthesis components. Which architecture meets the requirement? A. Use custom voice alone and send action names as pronunciation entries. B. Chain batch transcription, key phrase extraction, and standard text-to-speech for every turn. C. Use fast transcription alone and treat the completed transcript as the agent response. D. Connect the backend to VoiceLive through WebSocket events and use its function calling capability. Lock in your answer. Correct response, D. Connect the backend to VoiceLive through WebSocket events and use its function calling capability. Why this works. VoiceLive is a fully managed, low-latency interface that integrates speech recognition, generative AI, and text-to-speech. A backend or middle-tier service connects through WebSocket events, and VoiceLive function calling enables external actions and tools. Exam pattern. Choose Managed Agentic Speech Orchestration and its server-to-server action path. Question 9. A developer is comparing 4 text analysis configurations. Match each configuration to the behavior or implementation approach established by the held evidence. Visible artifact. Snippet A takes unstructured text, seeks representative wording that surfaces central themes, and has no labeled training data. Snippet B calls beta chat completions parse, targets a calendar event with name, date, and participants, and instructs the model to return values for that type. Snippet C sets function schema enforcement to strict and disables concurrent tool invocations. Snippet D sets the response format to JSON object. Requirements: 1. Snippet A. 2. Snippet B. 3. Snippet C. 4. Snippet D. Available targets. A. Train a project model from labeled examples when new domain-specific entity classes are required. B. Constrain function arguments to the declared schema in a request that disables concurrent tool calls. C. Guarantee parsable JSON while leaving compliance with a supplied schema unenforced. D. Populate an application-defined typed event object from the model response. E. Use the legacy pre-built phrase salience operation. No custom model training is needed. Lock in your answer. Correct response 1, Snippet A, matches use the legacy pre-built phrase salience operation. No custom model training is needed. 2, Snippet B matches populate an application-defined typed event object from the model response. 3, Snippet C matches constrain function arguments to the declared schema in a request that disables concurrent tool calls. 4, Snippet D matches guarantee parsable JSON while leaving compliance with a supplied schema unenforced. Why this works. Key phrase extraction returns main concepts and is held as a legacy Azure Language capability. The OpenAI V1 calendar event example combines a task instruction with a typed response format and parses into that schema. Strict structured function calling requires parallel tool calls to be false. JSON mode guarantees valid JSON, but not strict schema adherence. Exam pattern. Interpret configuration snippets and distinguish legacy topic extraction, schema-constrained extraction, strict function call limits, and JSON-only guarantees. Question 10. A team uses the latest GA Azure OpenAI API v1 with a deployed GPT-4o version 2024-08-06 model. It must extract incident fields into a typed object that strictly follows the team's JSON schema. The workflow does not use bring your own data, assistance, or Foundry agent service. Which implementation should the team choose? A. Use structured outputs with a task-specific system instruction and the typed JSON schema as the response format. B. Move the request to Foundry agent service and enable structured outputs on the same deployment. C. Use translator adaptive custom translation with reference pairs to extract the incident object. D. Use JSON mode and assume valid JSON guarantees strict conformance to the typed schema. Lock in your answer. Correct response. A. Use structured outputs with a task-specific system instruction and the typed JSON schema as the response format. Why this works? Structured outputs constrain a model to a supplied JSON schema. The held extraction pattern uses a task-specific system instruction and parses the response into a typed schema. GAP-EV1 supports structured outputs, and the held model list includes GPT-4o version 2024-08-06. JSON mode guarantees valid JSON, but not strict schema adherence, while Foundry Agent Service is explicitly unsupported for structured outputs in the held evidence. Exam pattern. Configure a supported GA model and API for task-specific typed domain extraction. You are halfway through the practice exam. Reset your attention. Keep speech, language, translation, safety, PII, sentiment, and structured output boundaries clear, and verify the exact mechanism each requirement needs. Question 11. An enterprise is migrating an authenticated Azure Translator Text version 3.0 integration to the latest GA release. Translation processing must be constrained geographically, and the team will validate the migration before production. Which implementation plan satisfies the held 2026-06-06 contract? A. Keep version 3.0. Use the global endpoint and rely on automatic routing to constrain processing to one selected geography. B. Set API version equals 2026-06-06. Replace 2 with a targets array. Use a regional endpoint and test the revised request and response handling. C. Set API version equals 2026-06-06, but keep the version 3.0 payload and response parser because the release is backward compatible. D. Use the unauthenticated languages operation for translate so regional endpoint selection is unnecessary. Lock in your answer. Correct response. B. Set API version equals 2026-06-06. Replace 2 with a targets array. Use a regional endpoint and test the revised request and response handling. Why this works. Translator Text 2026-06-06 is the latest GA release, but is not backward compatible with version 3.0. Migration requires changes to the API version, payload, response handling, and methods. The version 3.02 parameter is replaced by a targets array. A regional endpoint is the held choice for constraining processing geography, and translate remains an authenticated operation. Exam pattern. Plan a breaking translator migration while preserving authentication and geographic endpoint scope. Question 12. A company is migrating an enterprise text translation application from Azure Translator Text version 3.0 to API version 2026-06-06, the latest GA release. The company requires centralized identity and keyless access. Which 2 changes should the implementation team make? Select 2 answers. A. Run both NNT and LLM translation for every request to satisfy the 2026-06-06 contract. B. Authenticate translate by using Microsoft Intra ID bearer authentication. C. Keep the version 3.0 request and response shapes because the GA API is backward compatible. D. Call translate without authentication because the languages operation is unauthenticated. E. Replace the version 3.02 parameter with the 2026-06-06 targets array and update response parsing for the breaking contract. Lock in your answer. Correct response. B. Authenticate translate by using Microsoft Entra ID bearer authentication. E. Replace the version 3.02 parameter with a 2026-0606 targets array and update response parsing for the breaking contract. Why this works. Translator Text 2026-0606 is GA, but introduces breaking changes from version 3.0, including use of a targets array and changed response handling. Translate supports Microsoft Entra ID, which is typically preferred when an enterprise requires centralized identity and keyless access. Exam pattern. Choose the contract and authentication changes required for an enterprise version 3.0- to 2026-0606 migration. Question 13. A claims processing application must extract event details into a typed object that strictly follows a supplied JSON schema. The team will use the latest GA Azure OpenAI API and wants a model/version directly listed as supporting structured outputs. Which design should the team implement? A. Use JSON mode with any deployed model because valid JSON guarantees strict adherence to the supplied schema. B. Use Translator 2026-0606 adaptive translation with 5 reference pairs to create the typed extraction object. C. Use OpenAI version 1 with GPT-4o version 2024-08-06, a task-specific instruction and structured outputs with the supplied JSON schema. D. Attach the schema to a Foundry agent service workflow because structured outputs are supported there without model restrictions. Lock in your answer. Correct response, C. Use OpenAI version 1 with GPT-4o version 2024-08-06, a task-specific instruction and structured outputs with the supplied JSON schema. Why this works. Azure OpenAI structured outputs constrain a model to a supplied JSON schema. The latest GA API v1 supports structured outputs, and GPT-4o version 2024-08-06 is directly listed as supported. A task-specific instruction plus the schema provides the documented typed extraction mechanism. Exam pattern. Select a supported GA instruction plus schema design for typed domain extraction. Question 14. A support platform has an existing Azure Language sentiment route and receives a complaint as review text plus an attached PDF. The output must identify aspect targets and assessments in the review, return harm categories with severity and blocklist matches, and redact PII or PHI in the native document. Which routing design preserves the 3 result contracts? A. Send both inputs through content safety. Map blocklist matches to redactions, map harm categories to opinion targets, and calculate document sentiment from the returned severity values. B. Send the review to sentiment with opinion mining equals true and separately to content safety. Send the PDF to PII detection, then correlate the independent outputs by complaint identifier. C. Send the review to base sentiment and infer aspect targets from document confidence scores. Send the PDF to content safety for redaction, then derive harm severity from PII entity confidence. D. Send the review to PII detection and treat entity categories as opinion targets. Send the PDF to opinion mining, then interpret assessment sentiment as the safety severity result. Lock in your answer. Correct response, B. Send the review to sentiment with opinion mining equals true and separately to content safety. Send the PDF to PII detection, then correlate the independent outputs by complaint identifier. Why this works. Sentiment with opinion mining equals true returns aspect targets and assessments. Content safety returns harm categories, severity, and blocklist matches. PII detection handles PII or PHI redaction in supported native documents. Correlation preserves those meanings, rather than reinterpreting confidence or severity. The sentiment route is existing because new projects are directed away from this retiring legacy surface. Exam pattern. Preserve independent result contracts while correlating outputs. Question 15. A Foundry project must translate a pre-recorded audio file into text in a specified target language by using the Preview LLM speech path. Which request configuration meets the requirement? A. Use default fast transcription with task set to translate, because every LLM speech transcription mode supports translation. B. Post the audio to Azure Translator Text 2026-0606 and supply a targets array, because LLM speech uses the translator request contract. C. Stream live audio through standalone speech translation, because the Preview LLM speech path requires real-time input. D. Post multi-part audio and request properties to transcriptions, transcribe with API version equals 2025-1015, enhanced mode enabled, task set to translate, and target language set. Lock in your answer. Correct response, D. Post multi-part audio and request properties to transcriptions, transcribe with API version equals 2025-1015, enhanced mode enabled, task set to translate, and target language set. Why this works. Preview LLM speech translates pre-recorded audio through a multi-part transcriptions transcribe request. The documented translation call uses API version 2025-1015, enables enhanced mode, sets task to translate, and requires target language. Exam pattern. Configure the exact Preview LLM speech request for pre-recorded audio translation. Question 16. An existing Azure Language Sentiment REST integration must temporarily return the product attributes mentioned in customer comments and the assessments associated with those attributes. The workload is scheduled to migrate before sentiment analysis and opinion mining retire from Azure Language on March 31st, 2029. What should the developer do now? A. Pin a sentiment model version, because base sentiment always includes opinion targets when versioned. B. Set opinion mining equals true in the sentiment analysis request. C. Enable synthetic replacement anonymization to return product targets and assessments. D. Treat each negative document label as a content safety harm category result. Lock in your answer. Correct response, B. Set opinion mining equals true in the sentiment analysis request. Why this works. Opinion mining is the aspect-based extension of Azure Language Sentiment Analysis. For REST results to include targets and assessments, the request must set opinion mining equals true. This operational path is limited to the stated existing implementation pending migration before March 31st, 2029. Exam pattern. Enable aspect-level opinion results in an existing Azure Language Sentiment REST integration. Question 17. A voice live agent frequently misrecognizes a small set of product names. The team wants the lightest weight input customization and does not yet need advanced recognition fine-tuning. What should the team configure? A. Add a phrase list for the domain-specific product names. B. Train a custom voice so the agent pronounces the product names while listening. C. Submit a custom voice intake request to change speech recognition input. D. Deploy a custom speech model immediately, because phrase lists are only for synthesized output. Lock in your answer. Correct response, A. Add a phrase list for the domain-specific product names. Why this works. VoiceLive supports phrase lists for lightweight input customization. Custom speech models are the advanced recognition fine-tuning option, while custom voice is a separate synthesized output customization with limited access and an intake requirement. Exam pattern. Choose between phrase lists, custom speech, and custom voice for a narrow VoiceLive recognition problem. Question 18. An application already uses an Azure Language endpoint and key for sentiment analysis. The team must add raw text detection for hate, sexual, self-harm, and violence categories, including block lists and severity configuration. Which implementation is supported by the documented Azure AI Content Safety path? A. Map negative sentiment confidence to harm severity and use mixed sentiment as the block list match indicator. B. Reuse the language endpoint and key, then add harm category fields to the existing sentiment request because the credentials and API contract are shared. C. Use Azure Language PII detection in any region because documented sensitive content support includes all safety categories. D. Create a content safety resource in a supported region. Grant cognitive services user or higher on that resource. Use its endpoint and key. And call content safety/text. Analyze with API version equals 2024-0901. Lock in your answer. Correct response, D. Create a content safety resource in a supported region. Grant cognitive services user or higher on that resource, use its endpoint and key, and call content safety/text. Analyze with API version equals 2024-0901. Why this works? The content safety text path is product local. It requires a content safety resource in a documented supported region. Cognitive services user or higher on that resource, and that resource endpoint and key. The documented REST request uses content safety/text. Analyze with API version equals 2024-0901. Exam pattern. Add safety analysis without transferring Azure Language credentials, regions, or result semantics to content safety. Question 19. A call center transcription service has trained 2 custom speech candidates for real-time recognition of product terminology. The team must choose a candidate and keep production behavior predictable as base models evolve. Which 3 steps belong in the rollout plan? Select 3 answers. A. Track model usability dates and schedule an explicit endpoint update when the team chooses a newer trained model. B. Deploy the accepted custom speech model to a custom endpoint before directing real-time recognition traffic to it. C. Promote the candidate with the lowest training loss, using that value in place of recognition testing on held audio. D. For the real-time pilot, reference the custom model through the batch transcription path to avoid hosting a deployment. E. Leave the endpoint unchanged after a base model release and treat its deployed model as having adopted the newer snapshot. F. Evaluate each candidate on labeled test audio and compare word error rate before deciding whether more training is needed. Lock in your answer. Correct response, A. Track model usability dates and schedule an explicit endpoint update when the team chooses a newer trained model. B. Deploy the accepted custom speech model to a custom endpoint before directing real-time recognition traffic to it. F. Evaluate each candidate on labeled test audio and compare word error rate before deciding whether more training is needed. Why this works? Custom speech uses recognition testing and word error rate to compare accuracy and decide whether more training is required. Real-time use requires the selected model to be deployed to a custom endpoint. The no-hosted endpoint exception is limited to batch transcription. A deployed model remains fixed until the team updates it, and model usability is time-limited, so dates and explicit endpoint updates belong in operations. Exam pattern. Build a rollout plan that distinguishes model evaluation, real-time deployment, and explicit lifecycle control. Question 20. A new model-based workflow must extract fields from text and guarantee that the response strictly follows a JSON schema supplied with the inference call. Which mechanism should the developer use? A. Azure Language pre-built named entity recognition. B. Azure OpenAI JSON mode. C. Azure Language key phrase extraction. D. Azure OpenAI structured outputs. Lock in your answer. Correct response, D. Azure OpenAI structured outputs. Why this works. Structured outputs make the model follow a JSON schema supplied with the inference call and are intended for structured data extraction. JSON mode guarantees valid JSON, but does not guarantee strict adherence to the supplied schema. Exam pattern. Select the mechanism that guarantees a model response follows a supplied JSON schema. You completed AI-103 Practice Exam, Text Analysis Solutions. Review the mechanisms you missed, revisit the official documentation where needed, and use the next set to strengthen your exam-ready judgment. Thank you for practicing with WebLizard CertLab. Continue with AI-103 Practice Exam, Information Extraction Solutions.